Hello, and welcome to the July 13th weekly JupyterLab meeting. Today we have a scant 13 people on the call, which is less than usual, but acceptable. So let's get started. If you haven't already, please add your name to the agenda. And if there's something you'd like to discuss, please add a bullet point. Currently, we have 3 bullet points, well, 3 top level people anyway, which means this might be a short meeting again. And with that, why don't we get started? Johan, you are the first person.
Hi, everyone. So very good news on my side. The migration to Kernel 6 is almost done. I have only one left issue in the visual regression test that I hope to fix by tonight. And when it's done, there is also one other failing test, which is unrelated to this PR. So it's the release test on Linux. Jeremy is already looking at that, and this failure occurs on other branches. So I think we should be able to merge this PR when all the other tests are green. And the reason for doing that as soon as possible is that I'm leaving for 3 weeks at the end of the month for vacations, and I would like to be, present to help people to fix issues or to migrate other extensions like Integrator to the new Kernel 6. And that's it for me.
Thank you. So for people who are less familiar with this, if you go through our back catalog of meeting minutes, you'll find a link to a presentation Johan gave on the Kernel 6 about a month ago, I think. And this is really exciting. So anyone on the call who has some bandwidth and inclination, please take a look at the PR. I have been, a few other people have been. I don't think there's any reason not to merge and iterate. There are things that we won't know we want to do, but we don't have to do right away. Like we want to remove the editor abstraction, and we want to make sure that edge cases that maybe haven't come up in the original implementation are caught. So, please have your eyes on this because it's a big one. And if you have an outstanding PR, you might have to rebase. But thank you. This is awesome.
I was in the performance meeting last week, and Frederick said that this Kernel 6 PR significantly improves performance in a way that's making it so he's prioritizing helping you with the pull request way above his virtualization pull request. So apparently, like creating lots of these CM6 editors and refreshing them when the browser changes sizes according to his benchmarks is significantly better. So that's really cool.
William, do you think the virtual rendering still makes sense even after CodeMirror 6, or does that get us close enough?
But it's much higher priority to get CodeMirror 6 in than the virtualization. But the virtualization still has value for various reasons, but it's very challenging. So I think it makes sense. But
cool. That is one among many reasons why this is really exciting, and I'm glad to see it going in.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I want to give this a thorough review. That's not meant to be a threat. That's just a fact.
That's just what a threatener would say. But cool,
that's fair.
Were all the bugs in CodeMirror 6, if any, that you guys found fixed now? So I think that could be. I think you guys found some CodeMirror 6 bugs in this project.
Yeah, there was one. One is not really a bug. It's like something that changed in the parsing, and another one was effectively was indeed a bug, but it was fixed. It was in the beta, and now that is released, really Kernel 6.0. So yeah, the bug has been fixed and released.
One question about CodeMirror 6, does it still have a refresh API?
No, it's kind of hidden. You don't call refresh directly. Everything is supposed to work out of the box, so you don't have to bother yourself with that. But you can ask as there is something like require measurement or something like that, which is something you can call if really
Nice.
does not work directly.
Nice. That, yeah, refresh was always really difficult to reason about it. When we didn't put it in enough, we saw a lot of bugs. When we put it in too much, it killed performance. It was sort of a lose-lose scenario. So that's great that the model has changed.
Yeah, so the rule now is just like, don't do anything. And if you have an issue, you can call require measurement just once and it should be okay.
There's also a question in the chat from Mike. Is there a list of regressions which were not addressed in this PR, like removed multiplexing mode, highlights, testing, adding a mode, etc.?
Not yet, but I think it makes sense to open an issue with that. So yeah, we are missing multiplexing mode. Adding a new mode. I mean, adding a new mode is still possible. Just that you have to either use the legacy one, which is a port of Kernel 5 modes, or to just re-implement one. Highlighting is now available. There is a single slight difference in the parsing regarding the self keyword in Python. So it's not highlighted anymore because it's not considered as a keyword, or it's just like a variable like another one. So in the parser, you don't have it. And yeah, so only the multiplexing mode has to be added. And also I removed the token that we're exporting the Kernel 5 singleton, because it does not make sense in Kernel 6. But we may want to add another token for like registering theme or highlighting or other extensions. So that's something we can do in the following PR.
Cool, great. All right. Looks like I am next. So I have two totally unrelated updates. One is, you might know that there is a pull request in the Jupyter governance repo that is in the middle of the voting phase. It's about halfway through the voting phase. And this pull request is the third and final plank of the new governance, which has some knock-on effects. One is that as we ramp up all of the new governance, we want to take the next step with each sub-project that's created a council and to start picking software steering council representatives. So if you are on the JupyterLab council and on this call, I have two requests. One is to think about whether you want to nominate more people for the JupyterLab council. And if you are unaware of who's on it, you can go to the Team Compass, and the Team Compass links to the actual page that renders the repo on the right-hand side. You know how a repo can have a page link. It takes you to a read the docs, and it has the list of the current members of the JupyterLab council. It is, I think, not so small that it is unrepresentative, but I think it could be bigger. So if there are people you'd like to nominate, now's a good time. And then soon, in the coming few weeks, I think we should look for a representative. So if there is someone who is currently on the JupyterLab council and thinks they would like to attend meetings of the Software Steering Council when it convenes, which hasn't yet happened, and also would like to be JupyterLab's representative at that meeting, which means you pay attention to what's happening here and you try to keep abreast of the sorts of issues that will have knock-on effects in other projects in Jupyter, and to be willing to vote on cross-project issues. Then if you are interested in doing this, think about putting up your own name for nomination. If there is someone you think in the JupyterLab Council might want to do this, you could approach them and ask them if they want to be nominated. And again, if there's someone you think ought to be on the council, now's a good time to nominate them. So yeah, that's all I had to say about the new governance things that are happening. But Brian, I don't know if you want to chime in with anything.
Mostly just reinforcing what you've said, Darian. Thanks so much for talking about this. I pasted a link to the document there that describes the responsibilities of the Software Steering Council, and it also is essentially a job description of the people who will be serving on the SSC. It's really, I think, I'm really excited about the SSC. The cross-project technical design and leadership, we've really been struggling with that in recent years. And I'm excited to see it move forward and looking forward to seeing one of the JupyterLab council members step forward and dive into this. It's an exciting time for the project because of this.
Yeah, I agree. So two things. One is Isabella asked a question about whether there's a timeline for this. So barring the kind of question that leads to more drafting, the voting period for the Executive Council pull requests and governance ends in about 2 weeks. And what that means is a sequence of things needs to happen soon thereafter. They're not timed specifically, but basically the benevolent dictator for life, BDFL, Fernando, he steps down in a bloodless coup. And we tried to convene a software steering council as soon as possible. Currently, only one project has a named rep. I imagine as soon as there's two, we're going to make those two people meet and get them to maybe show up to other projects to exhort them to pick their reps as well. But this isn't as lightweight as just putting it on your radar, but it isn't as urgent as you got to do something right now. It's somewhere in between those two extremes. That was one point. The other point was a response to Brian. The one thing I think neither one of us said, but we should make clear here is there will be, after this PR, also an election for members of the Executive Council. So those elections will be open to anyone who is currently on any council of any sub-project. I think also it's open to all Jupyter distinguished contributors, but it might not be. I think if we just said the union of councils, that is actually what we said. So if you're on any sub-projects council, you can self-nominate or be nominated to run to be in the Jupyter Executive Council. And I imagine not that many people are interested in both being a software steering council rep and an executive council member. But if there is such a person, unfortunately, the way we've written the governance, you cannot do both. It seems like too onerous a thing. So that's the only real consideration you should have. So if it is something that you would consider doing and you want that to be an option on day one to run for the executive council, then don't put your name up for an SSC nomination. But that's really the only constraint. Yeah, both positions are a lot of work, Brian says in the chat. That is accurate. Okay. Now for a completely different thing. So as you're probably aware, because we've had a few conversations both in this call and in the RTC call and on 2 pull requests in the repo, we have 2 different ideas and approaches for how to get RTC closer to shipping in JupyterLab 4. And one approach was implemented by Carlos, and roughly speaking, it is something like creating shared types that are primitive data structures like strings or maps or lists that are collaborative by creating a sort of wrapper around YJS primitives. And then supplementing our models to use those data structures, like cell model has a shared text, that kind of idea. And the other is to create instead models that are collaborative models that represent larger things. So not simple primitives like a string or a list, but rather a cell or a notebook. And to have a package of shared models where these collaborative data structures exist as the data models backing things like cells and notebooks, but to also have our pre-existing notebook model, which is more like a traditional view model, let's say. Between these two approaches, there's been a lot of back and forth, and we opened 2 issues for a vote, which those votes both have ended and have results, but it did not really bring us closer to adjudicating between these 2 PRs. On Monday, there was a pre-scheduled RTC call. It happens every 2 weeks in case you're interested. In this call, there happened to only be 4 of us. I tried to summarize some of that discussion in the issue, in the pull request that I just closed, which is the shared types pull request, Carlos's pull request. And what came out of that basically is asking Kevin to make a few changes in his approach to match the outcome of the 2 votes. One is to take his concept of a collaborative notebook data model, the Y notebook, and to put that in the package with the notebook widget and the notebook model. And if we want there to be a shared models package, to re-export it, to make that be a meta package, so that the APIs don't change for users, but we have things residing with their logical semantic counterparts. The other thing was to make sure notebook metadata can be set and gotten via specific subkeys instead of extension authors dealing with it as just a blob. Now, its implementation still is that it's just a JSON object that gets written to and from the CRDT, but the actual APIs you give to users, they can get a key and set a key individually. That probably needs some iteration still. And then to verify that, so Carlos in his PR fixed this catastrophic data failure bug that we saw manifest a few times when we tried RTC on this call, and that people using collaborative mode in their classes discovered. And so Carlos had fixed that, and we verified that Kevin's approach also resolves this issue. Kevin's PR still needs a rebase now, and there's some of those things that I just described still need to be implemented. But in the interim, I've closed Carlos's PR. Carlos has been remarkably open-minded and patient about all of this. I actually worked on his PR with him and wrote a bunch of code myself in order to try to experiment and see whether this approach could get us to where we want to be. But it just turned out that this shared types approach really requires either reauthoring a lot of JupyterLab or having abstractions that are leaky, that at some points where you don't want, you still must access these shared models and these shared documents. And so it would be very painful to go re-architect the document registry and the way notebooks are passed back and forth and the way cells are instantiated via factories and stuff like that. So that's where we are. That's the update. If you're curious, please read the comment I wrote closing Carlos's PR. If you are even more curious and have time, please review Kevin's PR. But we want to get this in the same way we want to get the CodeMirror 6 stuff in, because people are going on vacation, because we need to release JupyterLab 4, and because we are down to the implementation we want to go with. So yes, that is all. I said a lot. If there's anyone who wants to react to that, please do.
Darian, thank you so much for helping with all this. I know it's been a lot of work to get those, get alignment and review the PRs. One question, do we have a sense of how stable, I know we've made fixes in JupyterLab 3 in the meantime. Do we have a sense of how stable RTC is in JupyterLab 3?
Without either of these merged, like as of right now?
Yeah, in the latest release of JupyterLab 3.
Yeah, it is. There are circumstances where when multiple users connect, initialization of the document might lead to losing the entire content of the document. So we can't even ask end users in good faith who are doing anything but playing around to turn on collaborative mode because they may lose their document.
Is what level, and I guess what I'm trying to understand here is, do we, if we have a known data loss bug in a stable release, even an experimental feature, I think we need to communicate that to users in some way. Or is it more that sort of we don't trust ourselves that we found all the ways that things can go wrong, even though we've fixed the things that we're aware of? So I don't know, that's what I'm trying to make sense of.
I don't remember if we added a message when you turn on the collaborative flag. I guess I can check that pretty easily. We might have actually added a message that says the collaborative flag is experimental, but if we haven't,
Yeah, so,
I'm not
but
sure.
yeah, I'm pretty sure we have something that says it is experimental.
Mhm.
But for a project that's as large and has the profile of Jupyter, I don't know that experimental quite capture. If indeed we have known data loss bugs, I don't think the word experimental captures that.
I just ran it and I didn't actually even see the word experimental come up. What I would say is that you have to deliberately be trying to launch this feature to get this, and it isn't something we've had issues come in except for the one that first alerted us to this. So the severity is quite high. I completely concede that, but it turns out the incidence appears to be really low. Like we haven't had issues posted where somebody said something happened. And as soon as we merge Kevin's PR, well, actually, that probably only targets 4. It probably doesn't fix the 3.x. So maybe we should fix the 3.x line because we plan on supporting it so that at least, even if we call it a collaborative experimental feature or something, at least maybe, you know, it shouldn't cause you to lose your stuff. That's probably sound. Avita, you have your hand up. What's up?
Yeah, it's just information. The really experimental thing is around the cell level undo in the settings that has like a large warning saying like that this kind of undo thing is experimental in CRDT.
Oh, okay. So we're not warning you that just don't turn on collaborative. We're warning you about cell level undo being something that might react differently than you thought.
Yeah, that's the only thing I've seen that has this kind of warning, say like this is experimental, to just like do this on your own risk kind of thing.
Okay. So
So I'm curious whether that will be fixed in 4x with this PR as well, or whether that's a separate issue.
I think it's not currently working because the move feature is tied to cell level undo. And I think that hasn't shipped yet. So I don't know if we need that once we ship it. I think when we ship it in 4.x, it won't need to have that disclaimer on it. There's a couple paths we can take for 3.x. We could remove the collaborative flag. We could just never allow you to turn it on. And that's the security fix, is no catastrophic data loss, no collaborative flag in 3.x. If you want collaborative, upgrade to 4. That's one option. Unless it is, because keep in mind, both Carlos's PR and Kevin's PR both substantially changed the API that's currently in production in 3.4.3. So like if it is trivial to fix it, yeah, we probably should. If it's non-trivial, maybe we should simply remove collaborative from 3.x once 4.0 comes out. Silence is assent. No, I'm
Oh.
kidding.
Yeah, Brian dropped, as you wrote in chat.
Okay. All right. Anyway, think about this, but that is the current RTC update. If there are no more things you want to talk about in this subject, we can move on.
Thanks for sorting this out. It was a tricky situation, and it's nice that we're getting updates too. Definitely learning from your thoughts here.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it would be nice if we could avoid a situation when we have competing PRs in the future. And I'm trying to personally internalize some of the lessons here, but I hope, I hope never to have to adjudicate between two good faith efforts again, because it's not nice. Someone's always going to be disappointed. And with that, Isabella, you are up next.
Oh dear. I don't have much to say yet, but it's my usual announcement. This is a JupyterLab accessibility call week. It'll be 15 minutes after the scheduled end of this call. And yeah, I have some things to share today, including updates. I'm glad we had the governance note because I need to follow up about some of those things with our own sub project. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you all.
Cool. Thank you. Okay. David, you are up next.
Hey, so I want to call attention to this one issue that Brian actually raised, and it's a common issue that we've been seeing popping when we're trying to develop client extensions, most notably RTC and commenting. I'll post it in the chat just so you don't have to go back to the HackMD. But basically, the core issue is that it's actually a very non-trivial task to track the identity of a file across file system operations like moves, copies, deletes, etc. It's actually surprisingly challenging. And the real trick is to do this in a file system agnostic way. And what I mean by that is like we have JupyterLab users that are using Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and this feature like needs to work across all the different file systems. So for example, the most obvious application of this is with commenting, right? So right now, commenting is implemented, I believe, through a sidecar file. So basically, it's like something.ipynb, and then there's an adjacent file that stores all the comments. Well, the most obvious problem with this is that if you move the file but don't move the comments file, you lose all your data, right? So I think that's a pretty easy to understand application. And Brian and I have been working very closely for the last, I'd say about two weeks, dreaming up an implementation. And I did submit a draft PR for review here, and I do want to demo it during this call, which is basically a file ID service. A file ID service in Jupyter Server that basically keeps track of all of the files and gives them an associated identifier, like a unique ID. And basically, given an ID, you can query the path, and given a path, you can query an ID. So this relationship is bidirectional. And what this allows us to do is like, this allows us to track what we call in-band edits. So any edits that are done through the contents manager of Jupyter Server, we can track those easily because they're just like class methods. And so what a commenting extension would do in this scenario, right, is that rather than associating all of the comments with a given file path, it associates them with a file ID. And basically, whenever a user opens a file and it has a file ID matching that inside the comments extension, it will load the appropriate comments for that. So basically, like if I move a file, right, with a file ID of 1, and I move it to a different path, it maintains that ID. That file still has an ID of 1. So it's sort of, the ID is kind of immutable across moves. So yeah, the PR I sent in, I sent this in just now, right before the call. I was working on this up until the last minute, and I did want to call some attention here. But if we have time, I do want to just give a very brief demo of some of the work here. Any questions, first of all, before I start sharing my screen?
Mike asked in the chat, are there applications of this feature beyond the commenting extension? I imagine that the commenting extension could just be reworked to store comments in the notebook metadata. I would add that I've always personally imagined that comments are better served by being in metadata, so I can send someone a notebook and the comments are in it. But yeah, I'm curious what your reaction to this is.
Yeah, and the answer to that question has a lot to do with what we agreed to be the scope of the commenting extension. And I've talked about this with Brian. And what Brian has envisioned is that basically the commenting extension should work for any text file, not just Jupyter notebooks. And it should have the flexibility to do so even if we're not able to store metadata directly into the file. William asked, what happens if you, oh, sorry, before I move on to the next question. Yes, there are other applications of this feature beyond the commenting extension. Most notably, David's RTC work. To be honest, I'm not really familiar with RTC. I just, I have been told that this problem also popped up while in the development cycle of that feature. Moving on. What happens if you move a notebook while the kernel is running? Can you preserve state? I'm not really sure exactly what is meant by this question, but
just like if you started a Jupyter notebook running with the kernel that's running, and then you move the file from one directory to another or change the name. Is this meant to address any issues related to doing that? Or is that an unrelated question?
Well, all the file ID manager does is basically maintain the bidirectional relationship between the ID and the path. So basically, if you have an ID, you just call file ID manager.getPath, and then you pass in the ID. So yeah, like I guess in the sense like that's really all the file ID manager is doing. It's not, yeah, like the only state information we're appending to any given file is just an ID. So there's nothing specific to notebooks. And I think that was definitely part of the original design, is like, we don't want something that's specific to notebooks. We want an ID system that works across file systems and with any given file. I think this allows us to a lot more flexibility in what kind of client extensions we can build in the future.
So that sounds like that there would need to be follow-on work after your ID service exists in Jupyter Server, so that the client starts treating notebooks as things with file IDs and can react to that file having been moved or whatever, because now it has a handle that is persistent. But it sounds like out of the box, the work you're describing won't have any impact on what William is asking, but it can create some tools for us to build front-end logic to handle it. Is that correct?
Yeah, right now this is mainly for developing client extensions, although like any client extension that needs to append additional state information to files, like this is the service for that. And it's not really a separate service either. We went back and forth on this, but the implementation I settled with in my PR is just to add it directly into the Contents Manager API. So what? Let me find the relevant API doc. Here. Here we go. Yeah. Yeah. So basically the implementation I settled with is that if you check the link I just posted in the chat, right? So in the response JSON body, you have content, created, format, last modified, etc. And we just add a new property here called ID, which is an integer that just represents the file ID. Another great question by William is, if you use the UI in JupyterLab, renaming works amazingly well. But if you use a terminal to rename the file, then it breaks. Yeah, and that is that's something we discussed. We actually discussed this, I think 2 weeks ago in the Jupyter server call. But yes, that's absolutely right. Right now that is unresolved. But what the discussion that we had in a Jupyter server call was that right now, those client extensions would break anyways, right? So they don't handle out-of-band edits and they don't handle in-band edits. And what we mean by that is like in-band edits are like edits that you're doing through the Contents Manager, whereas out-of-band edits, you're doing them, well, outside the Contents Manager. You're circumventing it somehow, whether you're dragging and dropping it in the File Explorer or you're using some shell utility, right? You're doing an out-of-band edit that is much more difficult to track. And right now, yeah, that is definitely, there's a lot of work to be done on that front. But the general consensus is that the file ID service right now is purely additive. So at least it, yeah, at least it handles in-band edits. Michael asks, what is the ID, a number, a UUID? I think yeah, right now it's just an integer. And that's subject to change, honestly. Like, I don't think we should lock that in. It just needs to be unique, that's all. Yeah, I think I'm just going to share my screen and give a brief demo of the file ID service.
Cool.
I think that will help clarify a lot of things. So, whoa, holy crap. What? Oh, I have to open system preferences and then.
In the interim, Mike's question, what is the ID, a number, a UUID for context LSP protocol uses URIs? I think David said the ID is a number. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just an integer. Hold on, I think I need to.
You're gonna have to restart your Zoom client, David. So
right.
I can fill in for a moment. Yeah, the IDs that are generated are numeric. They're not UUIDs or URIs.
And so there's nothing intrinsic about a notebook file and the ID, right? So if Kevin emails a notebook file to me, I upload it via the File Explorer in JupyterLab. That has an ID, and it's not going to somehow collide with a pre-existing one, or can it? I guess I'm not sure. Like,
you should not expect it to collide, and also keep in mind that these are not notebook IDs. That if you have a Python script or a metadata file, sorry, a Markdown file, those are also tagged with IDs.
If I upload an identical document multiple times, do they register as different IDs?
If you give it different file names, yes.
Okay, I see.
And
Okay.
the file path includes, like, there's no way, in at least to my knowledge, in any file system to upload a file with the exact same name in the same directory. So if
Google
there is,
Drive allows this.
what?
So Google Drive allows this. It's a very silly UI, but you can end up with literally the same exact file name with the same exact file content as multiple listings in a Google Drive folder. But that's not a true file system, although I bet somebody's wrapped it as a file system. I don't know how to
Yeah.
deal with it.
Well, that is truly troublesome. But right now, the draft PR only handles local file systems. So yeah. Let me know if you can see my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
That's wonderful. Okay. So basically, the way the file ID manager works is when you start the server, it just indexes the server root, and it does a shallow index. There's been a lot of discussion in the original issue, and you all can read up on the lore there. But basically, at least for the initial implementation, we're doing a shallow index, which means we are only indexing these files. So we're not indexing the directories recursively. And what I mean by that is if we open the SQLite shell, this is how we're implementing the file ID manager, by the way. It's really just a simple SQLite table. But as you can see, can you all see the terminal, by the way?
Yep.
Yes. Although you may want to
Okay.
bump up the font size a little bit. It's a bit hard
Yeah.
to read.
Let's go crazy. Let's just make it real big. How about that?
That's better.
Yeah, awesome. So as you can see, each file is given a identifier. Now, if we open a directory, the file ID manager then indexes again a shallow index, does a shallow index of all the files within that directory. So if we do the same command again, I don't know why this thing's not going away, but you can see here, it gives a new ID to each of the files within the documents directory. And I did a lot of work here, but it also supports deletes as well. So if we create a few untitled files, right? And then we run this thing again, we see that, okay, so under untitled folder, we have untitled.txt, blah, 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 right? We have 3 of these files. And if we delete one, well, we can see that that was removed from the files table. So if you so if you had an ID to the old file and then tried to look up the path, well, that path no longer exists anymore, right? Because we deleted that file. So this also works recursively. So if we were to rename untitled folder to ASDF, and then we rerun this query, we see that the file ID is preserved. So originally the file IDs were 25 and 27, and here we can see that the IDs are still 25 and 27. We just modified the associated path. Same thing works with recursive deletes. So if we delete this directory, we should see that that is also completely removed from the table after that as well.
Is this tied to using Jupyter for file manipulation, or can you just delete stuff from the terminal?
Yeah, so this is, like I said earlier, this right now, the base implementation only handles what we call in-band edits. So yes, anything that you're doing through the Jupyter server. So like if you move files through the JupyterLab UI, it makes a request to Jupyter server. So that counts as an in-band edit. Yeah, Yeah, but right now, if you were to like use shell utilities like MV or CP, then this wouldn't work.
Is
Um,
there a path to get it to where that could work, or is it undoable?
It's our
No.
consensus is that it's definitely doable. And the reason we believe this is so is that Git essentially does that. So if you read up on Git's implementation, it's actually very interesting, but they ran into very similar issues that we're running into, which is like, how do you track the state of a file without using a file system daemon, right? Because Git has a similar use case where it needs to be file system agnostic and it can't append any metadata to a given file. And there are ways of doing this. There are definitely ways of tackling this problem. It's just these solutions may be a little more complex than it might seem at initial glance.
But Git needs to create an index recursively all the way down its tree at the beginning so that it always has something to compare it to.
Mhm.
Is that the sort of approach you would take where the server basically has a parallel tree structure or something?
That is a possibility. Another line of investigation is that I do know that Git uses some heuristics to make this a lot faster. Because if you were to compare the whole like repository tree, it would take a pretty long time because that complexity grows linearly. So it does employ a few heuristics, and one of the heuristics I was investigating, and I haven't like really started working on it yet, but because I was working on this. But rather than having just an auto incrementing integer primary key for the file ID, we could try building some kind of hash using immutable file metadata. So like we build a hash from the name and then the date modified and things like that. Again, that's a very rough sketch. I haven't really fully fleshed out that idea. But if we were to build that, instead of using an integer primary key, instead we use some kind of hash that is where we input the file metadata into the hash function, we could do some kind of lookup so that when we encounter the file again, which may have been touched by shell utilities, we can still look up the file ID.
There are 2 questions in the chat, or 3 questions.
Yeah, let me take a look.
Let's see. So Robert asked, if you give a mouse or a notebook an ID, it will then ask you for a version. If you give it a version, it will ask you for last updated timestamp. If you give it the last updated timestamp, it will ask you who made the last update. Okay. Yeah. I can see that. Mike asks about extensions that do remote file systems. And William asks if it's a hard requirement to not use a file system watching daemon.
Yeah. So with remote file systems, the file ID manager is configurable. So it's implemented in the same way that the contents manager is. Hold on, here. So basically, you can developers can extend this file ID manager to whatever use case they can see fit, right? So I'm not really sure if that fully answers your question about remote file system support, but is there any remote file system support built into Jupyter server without any extensions, like the base Jupyter server implementation? Because if not, then I think that's a bit out of scope, right? Like the developer would just extend this class and then re-implement all these methods to suit their file system needs.
There might not be one out of the box, but you could still have remote mounts that look like normal file systems that Jupyter server is using, presumably.
Yeah, this should handle remote mounts. I haven't tested that, but yeah, like any in-band edits, like if you look through the implementation that I submitted through my PR, you'll notice that this really doesn't use any like file system utilities. Like we're not actually validating, we are not validating whether like the file exists at a path. Like that responsibility is delegated to the contents manager that is calling the file ID manager. Like really what the file ID manager is doing is really just maintaining a map between IDs and path strings. That's really like the sole responsibility of the file ID manager. And to handle recursive moves, we actually just iterate through the records and then call this update statement to basically we see do any of these file paths begin with the old name of the directory, and if so, we just replace them with the new name of the directory. That's really all we're doing. Yeah. So I think there's one more question. Yeah.
I was curious if not using a file system watcher is like a really hard requirement, because that would be the approach if you wanted to be able to track things like moving a file in the terminal or with another tool, rather than using heuristics like Git.
The problem with that is it's a bit more complex to implement that across operating systems. Yeah, I think there's definitely more discussion to be made in this issue, in the original issue. So please, if the rest of you have thoughts on this, please voice your concerns there. And we have gone back and forth, but I think at least where the discussion is at now is that it seems like building the file ID manager in a way where it doesn't care what file system you're on, in a way that it doesn't care whether you have a file system daemon. I think that is the most platform agnostic way of implementing this. Like for example, like with JupyterLab Google Drive, right? Like you don't have access to a file system daemon for like remote file systems, right? Like I don't know if there's any API methods you can use for that, right? Like you can't listen to Google Drive events, like when a user moves a directory or something like that.
Yeah, but you could imagine defensively trying to get a file watcher functionality, and if that doesn't exist on a platform, falling back to polling or something.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't be nice, but you can imagine a way where you try to support such a thing. I'm going to stop recording now, just in case there's anything anyone wants to say, especially since they might be coordinating. Type hi.
Yeah, I used up all the time. My apologies.
No, that's quite on.
That's what the time's for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, brace
Okay.
yourself, everyone. Here goes.